I would now like to introduce our speakers. Will Flatley is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Central Arkansas, and Francis O'Donnell is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at Auburn University. Welcome, Will and Francis.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary, and thank you also everyone for participating in this webinar. Francis and I are excited to share our results from this project and talk about what we found, what we were able to do as a result of funding through the Bureau of Reclamation and the Southern Rockies Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And so just to introduce the project, originally both Francis and I worked on this project as postdocs at Northern Arizona University, and we originally had separate projects that were funded through the Technology and Research Initiative Fund in Arizona, and then we were really pleased to receive additional funding through the Bureau of Reclamation SRLCC WaterSmart grant program, and that enabled us to really combine our two projects and leverage them into this particular project. So it was really great opportunity to work together. And so also just a note, maybe you have noticed that the title is slightly changed from what was on the previous slide and what was advertised. And so, essentially when we're talking about, we're going to be talking about restoration treatments for the rest of this presentation, but that really can be used interchangeably with fuel treatments that we're discussing. And so, generally in southwestern frequent fire forests, restoration of fire-suppressed forests will involve mechanical thinning, which restores structure and composition to these frequent fire forests after they've been suppressed for many years. And then that's often followed by prescribed burning, which will reduce surface fuels and maintain structure and composition following that initial thinning. And so that's what we are looking at in terms of fuel treatments and restoration treatments, is that reduction of forest density and then treatment of surface fuels. And the benefit of restoration is that from the perspective of the forest is that restoration restores historical structure and function, which can be important for wildlife, forest restoration, or regeneration. And then also it tends to create a forest that is fire resilient and resists crown fire. And so that's one of the reasons that forest restoration treatments are being pursued in frequent fire forests in the Southwest. But in addition to that, these restoration treatments might have the added benefit of potentially improving water conservation in forests and lower elevation areas that depend on water from forested areas and higher elevations of the Southwest. And so much of the water in the Southwest does come from high elevation forests, and restoration treatments often promote forest types that maintain consistent water flow and reduce high severity fire that can result in erosion, high sediment loads, and then water quality reductions. And so that's what we were interested in looking at, was assessing the benefits not only to forest outcomes but also to hydrologic outcomes of these restoration treatments. And then the other piece of this was throwing climate change into the mix. And so we are interested in testing really at the landscape scale, across a large landscape, how climate change would interact with these relationships between forest restoration and wildfire regimes, forest composition, and then finally hydrologic output in terms of water quantity and quality. And so our study objectives were to kind of test these questions within the Kaibab Plateau landscape, which I'll describe in just a second here. But study objective 1 was to predict changes in fire regimes and forest vegetation under a range of climate and restoration scenarios using a forest simulation model. And then 2, to estimate changes in future hydrologic and sediment output due to restoration and forest type change. And this is what, these second 2 objectives is what Francis will be talking about in the second half of the presentation. And then 3, identify areas of the Kaibab Plateau that are most likely to experience negative hydrologic impacts under these climate change scenarios and restoration scenarios. Okay, so this is our study area that we are carrying out this modeling study, the Kaibab Plateau, which is in northern Arizona. And the appeal of modeling this landscape is, one that it's an example of a landscape that's currently being managed for fire resilience by both Grand Canyon National Park and Kaibab National Forest. And it's also a primary source of water for valuable riparian habitat in the lower canyon, springs, and seeps. And then also it provides much of the water for park infrastructure, both on the north rim and the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And so, it's this large contiguous landscape, and it's a broad, high elevation plateau that covers approximately 800,000 acres, and it ranges in elevation from 4,700 feet to about 9,280 feet. And that wide range in elevation means that the plateau supports a broad range of forest types, from pinyon juniper, and so I'll just point it out on the slide here with my cursor. Pinyon juniper on the outer lower elevation portions of the plateau, and then ponderosa pine in the sort of lower mid-elevation regions, mixed conifer in the higher mid-elevation regions, and then spruce fir forest in the upper elevations. So a range of different forest types in this landscape, and consequently there also are a range of different fire regimes that vary from frequent low-severity fires historically in the ponderosa pine forest to infrequent high-severity crown fires that typified the interior of the plateau in the spruce fir and portions of the upper mixed conifer. And so having this contiguous landscape is important for climate change modeling in that it allows species to migrate uphill within the landscape, and it also allows fire to move between different forest types and spread across the landscape. And then I'll just finally point out that another appeal of this landscape was that we had quite a bit of dendroecological data that's been collected by Pete Fulé in his lab that we could use to parameterize the model and also validate our results and outputs from the model. Okay, so I won't go into too much detail about the nuts and bolts of the model, but essentially we used linked two different models in order to do the simulations of forests and fire on the Kaibab Plateau. And so the first is climate FVS, which is basically a bioclimatic envelope model that models species regeneration or establishment probability and then species growth rates according to either contemporary climate at different locations within the landscape or according to projected climate under projected future climate scenarios. So climate FBS provided kind of individual species regeneration and growth rates, which I then fed into LANDIS-II, which is a spatial landscape simulation model that basically is raster-based and simulates spatial processes like fire spread, forest succession, and individual species dispersal. And if you're interested in kind of getting into the details of how we did the modeling and then also our validation of the model, we have a publication down here at the bottom I've listed which came out in Ecosphere this past year and goes into the details of using both tree rings and to validate the model, and also the nuts and bolts of how the model actually works and how we parameterized it. Okay, so just an example of outputs from the model. We had maps of fire occurrence, and so on the left here is fire severity for one time step within the Kaibab Plateau, and you can see the red is high severity fire in the upper elevations, and then a lot of low severity area burned in the lower elevations of the ponderosa pine forest. And this, we were able to calibrate it and match fairly well the patterns of historical fire on the plateau. And then we also had forest biomass or forest composition maps coming out of LANDIS, and that also, we were able to match that against data from the tree ring record of reconstructed forest composition during the frequent fire period, and then also the contemporary fire suppressed period, and see whether that was matching up closely with, our model results were matching up closely with the field data that we had, and there was a good match. And again, you can look at this publication to see some of that calibration and validation. So for the methods, we, on this project, we tested a range of different climate scenarios, starting with one, just no climate change, and then we had two successive climate change scenarios, one being an ensemble of the representative concentration pathway 4.5, and so these RCPs are from the most recent 5th IPCC, and basically the RCP 4.5 presents sort of a moderate level of climate change or temperature increase, roughly 5.9 degrees Fahrenheit increase by the end of this century, and then the RCP 8.5, which has an increase of about 9.9 degrees Fahrenheit, so a more extreme level of climate change over the course of the next century. And so then we, in addition to the climate change scenarios, we also tested a range of restoration scenarios to see how they would affect the fire regime, and also compositional change over time, and then eventually the hydrology for the plateau. And our restoration scenarios were either no restoration being carried out, a low restoration scenario in which we applied thinning or prescribed burning on about 1.25% of the target area within the plateau. And so this target area, we were just carrying out these restoration treatments on the mid-elevation ponderosa pine forest and the mid-elevation mixed conifers, so the two forest types that were historically characterized by relatively frequent fire, and areas that you would typically in the Southwest apply restoration treatments. So, and that low restoration is roughly an 80-year rotation, so an 80-year return interval of those restoration treatments. And then the high restoration scenario treated a larger portion of the plateau with thinning or prescribed burns on 5% of the target area per year, with roughly equivalent to a 20-year rotation, so treating quite a bit more of the landscape in that high restoration scenario. Okay, so looking at the results, and I should say that I didn't mention that we carried out these simulations for 100 years, so starting in 2010, we initiated the climate change scenarios and the restoration scenarios, and then we modeled for 100 years up to 2110 in order to look at the outcomes over that roughly, or a century of change on the plateau. And so this first table is showing results of high severity area burned in thousands of acres during that 100-year simulation period. And so note here that the high restoration scenario did in fact have a large effect on the amount of high severity area burned. It reduced that area burned in high severity fires by about 60%. And we also did see a decent reduction, about 30%, in the amount of area burned in high severity fire with the low restoration scenario also. And interestingly, we didn't see really consistent results in terms of the climate change scenario affecting the amount of high severity area burned. You had a fair amount of high severity area burning in both the no change and the RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And so the amount of high severity area burn was important because this is really what was driving forest turnover and resulting compositional change on the Kaibab landscape. And so essentially what was happening is that under the climate change scenarios, if you have a high severity fire like this one here in the center of the plateau, after about 50 years or partway into the middle of this coming century, the forest species that are currently the spruce fir, Douglas fir, and aspen that are typical or currently in that high elevation to mid elevation range are not regenerating in those locations because of the warming temperature. And so what happens is if you have a high severity fire, that removes the overstory, and it essentially you don't have regeneration of those species that are currently there. The only viable species are from lower elevations like ponderosa pine, and it takes time for ponderosa pine to move uphill and establish in those high severity burned areas. And so the result is, if you look at, this is again a map of forest composition, and so on the left, this is a simulation of historical forest composition under the historical fire regime and contemporary climate conditions, just to show you the distribution of different forest types. And then on the right is one time step from one of the simulations showing forest composition in 2110 under the RCP 8.5 and no restoration scenario. And you can see that there's quite a bit of non-forest area here in the upper elevations where you've had high severity fires have burned, and the wet mixed conifer, spruce fir, and aspen are no longer viable, and so it's converted to non-forest area. And eventually what's going to happen is that ponderosa pine will move into that region, and then PJ will move up and replace ponderosa pine in what is currently the ponderosa pine zone, and you'll have dominance of ponderosa pine and PJ on the Kaibab landscape. Okay, so we just look at results of the, another way of looking at it is percent of landscape in the different forest types in 2110, and according to the different model scenarios. And so here, the first three are under the contemporary climate conditions, so you can use that as sort of like a control or the baseline scenario, and then compare that to these three are the RCP 4.5 scenarios, and then these three are the RCP 8.5. And so if you look at this, right off the bat, one of the big changes is, which I was mentioning before, is a major increase in the amount of non-forest area. And a lot of that is occurring at the expense of this gray mixed conifer and the purple wet mixed conifer and then aspen. But basically the high elevation forest communities are being replaced and generally converting to non-forest area because ponderosa pine has not moved up in elevation to establish at these sites. And so, looking at the restoration treatments, you can see that within a particular climate scenario, either RCP 4.5 or 8.5, that this high restoration scenario and to a lesser degree the low restoration scenario both conserve more of those higher elevation forest types and prevent them from being turned over in high severity fire. And I will note that they are, I refer to them as legacy forests because these species, the mixed conifer species and aspen, are not going to regenerate later on in the next century because it has become too warm. But carrying out restoration basically delays the turnover of those forests, and so you maintain those legacy species for longer into that next century, although eventually they are inevitably going to decline under these moderate and more extreme climate change scenarios. Okay, so conclusions for the forest modeling. One is, that trend of decline of mesic conifers and aspen. The higher elevation mesic conifers and aspen, or those forest types, are not regenerating and eventually are going to decline, although they, depending on our restoration and management of fire, they may persist on the plateau. Once they are established and mature individuals, they can persist as climate changes without regenerating. And so this will lead to a shift toward pinyon juniper and ponderosa forest types on the Kaibab Plateau and their eventual dominance. And restoration reduces high severity fire. It reduces the amount of non-forest area during the next century, and it delays the decline of legacy forests. And it does this in the high elevations, even though those restoration treatments, as I said, are only being carried out in the mid-elevation ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests. But it appears that those restoration treatments are reducing the spread of high severity fire into the upper elevation wet mixed conifer, aspen, and spruce fir forests. And then, I'll note that, both the low and high restoration rates have beneficial outcomes. So that high restoration rate of treating the most portion of the landscape has the most benefit in terms of preserving high elevation forest types and reducing non-forest area. But treating at the lower restoration rate also does show benefits and, supports the implementation of these restoration treatments, even if it is just a small portion of the landscape that managers, due to budgetary constraints, are able to treat. It still does have some benefit carrying out at least these restoration treatments in at least a portion of the forest area. Okay, so that wraps up my forest modeling section, and I think I have about 5 minutes if there are questions at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Will. This is Mary again. So folks in the audience, if you have some questions for Will, you have two options for asking those questions. You either can unmute your phone by pressing *6 and then mute it again when you're done pressing *6, or you can type in a question, sending it to me, the host, and I will read it to Will, and Will can reply to your questions. So we'll take a couple minutes here to see if it gives people enough time to formulate a question. If anybody would like ask a question by phone, you're ready, please go ahead and unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Will, this is John Rice. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. I've got a question on your modeling approach, and this will show how little I know about modeling. But when you do the modeling and you're projecting climate conditions in the future, is it strictly based on what the GCMs predict the temperature and precip will do, how that will change? And the reason I'm asking the question is it seems like, if we have average years through all of that time, we're in pretty good shape in terms of a transition from one forest type to another. But I'm kind of concerned about how maybe, 7 years of drought in the middle of that after a catastrophic fire will rather than simply delay that transition, it will increase the number of invasive species, maybe new species invade in, and so we actually get novel forest types that we don't know about rather than some of the ones that we're expecting in the future. Can you comment on that?
Sure, yeah. So that is one kind of drawback of this modeling setup, and particularly the climate FES feeding in, is that it really is based on, average conditions according to those GCMs and the particular RCP scenario. And so it doesn't, this is, really, what this model is doing is providing kind of a generalized view of how under those average conditions things will progress. And so, and that is a drawback, particularly, I think you're right about those extreme years, and you can use LANDIS to model drought-based mortality, but that is not something that we have included in this model. And, another possibility is insect outbreaks and how that might, increase the rate of forest turnover, or, just result in different patterns and timing. And so, I agree that is a concern, and something that this model is not necessarily incorporating, although, I think that it's likely that just the fact that you do have these large areas of forest turning over in high severity fire is likely to provide conduits for, as you're mentioning, invasive species and kind of novel species assemblages. And, I think that is something that you could do with LANDIS, is then, now that we've developed this with fire disturbance, is trying to tack on some of those additional processes and see how, drought disturbance might influence things, or, extreme dry years, or insect outbreaks.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we do have a couple questions that came in.
Okay.
The first one is from Rob. Wouldn't the higher elevation non-forested areas, the areas of spruce fir that were lost in the model, presumably be suitable for ponderosa pine?
Yeah. So that's that's where they're eventually headed, and so those high elevation areas, the species viability scores, go to 0 for spruce fir and those mesic conifers, and are high for ponderosa pine. So basically, those areas are available for ponderosa pine to establish. It's just, whether there are mature ponderosa pines that can provide seeds to establish individuals in those locations. And so, there is a lag in terms of the time that it takes for ponderosa pine to establish in the surrounding area and seed into those locations.
Thanks, Will. We have time for one more question, and we have one in the queue from John. How does restoration reduce fire? That is, does restoration suppress fuel load, modify structure, or something else?
So it's doing both. Where the restoration treatments that we're carrying out were thinning, so that's going to alter structure, and it's going to reduce canopy fuels. It's going to reduce forest density and canopy fuels, and then the prescribed burning is going to reduce surface fuels. And so kind of converting from a suppressed, dense fire-suppressed ponderosa pine forest to a forest that's been thinned and had its density reduced into, kind of clumps of larger diameter ponderosa pines. And then also the reduction of surface fuels through prescribed burning will reduce the likelihood of, not the likelihood of fire, but the likelihood of high severity or crown fire.
All right, thanks, Will.
Mm-hmm.
We can go ahead and transfer or hand off the presentation to Francis.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, are my slides up for everyone?
Yes. Thanks,
okay,
Francis.
Great. Thank you, and thank you to everyone for attending. I'm going to pick up with where Will left off to talk a little bit about how these forest changes are expected to impact water resources. In this region, vegetation cover exerts a strong control on water resources. Runoff and groundwater are the water resources that are left over for people and habitat after evapotranspiration. And in southwestern ecosystems, evapotranspiration can consume somewhere in the range of 60 to 90% of precipitation. The vegetation type matters in terms of how much precipitation goes to evapotranspiration. This is an example from a series of sites on an elevation gradient in the Sierra Nevada where evapotranspiration and precipitation were measured directly. At the lowest elevation in Oak Savanna, evapotranspiration consumed the highest percentage of precipitation. The percent of ET as percent of precipitation decreased in the higher elevation vegetation types. Because of this, we might expect that as vegetation shifts, we might have a change in partitioning to evapotranspiration, and that could influence water resources for people and for habitats. Disturbances can also influence water resources. Forest restoration has been found in a study in Ponderosa Pine near Flagstaff to result in a small and temporary decrease in evapotranspiration. High-intensity stand replacing wildfire results in larger reductions in evapotranspiration. These can also influence water quality as erosion can lead to suspended sediment in water. This is especially a problem for high-intensity wildfire, where increases of up to 100 times higher levels of suspended sediment have been observed following high-intensity wildfires. However, in studies of water quality following prescribed or managed burns that are typical of forest restoration, little to no increase in suspended sediment and erosion was found. So the main question for this part of the research is how vegetation type shifts, restoration, and wildfire will affect the quantity and quality of runoff from the Kaibab Plateau. This is an overview of our modeling approach. The blue shows the modeling that Will described in the first part of the webinar. The key outputs from the vegetation modeling are the future distribution of vegetation types on the Kaibab Plateau and the future Kaibab Plateau fire regime. In addition to these outputs, I used the management scenarios and the future precipitation projections for the two climate scenarios to conduct hydrologic modeling and a sediment yield vulnerability analysis. So now I'm going to take this red box and break it out into the methods for the hydrologic modeling. Evapotranspiration partitioning involves a number of complex and interrelated processes that are difficult to represent accurately in a process-based model. So we used an empirical approach. We developed statistical models based on previous data. For each vegetation type, we developed a unique regression equation relating precipitation and runoff. For each model cell, at each annual time step, we assigned a vegetation type based on the outputs of the vegetation model and used the regression equation for that vegetation type. We input the predicted precipitation for the RCP 4.5 or 8.5 climate scenario to get an annual runoff value for each of these model cells. To develop the regression equations, we use data from paired watershed studies conducted by the Forest Service and other groups across Arizona in the 1940s to 1980s. These span the full range of vegetation types currently found on the Kaibab Plateau, from pinyon juniper to high elevation forest and grassland. We also included lower elevation types that are predicted to exist in the future on the Kaibab Plateau, even though they don't exist currently. This is an example of the regression equations for chaparral, pinyon juniper, and ponderosa pine. One thing to note is that runoff in terms of volume is highly dependent on the area of a watershed. So we divided the runoff volumes by the area of each watershed that we use to develop these equations. That gives us a value of runoff in terms of depth in millimeters. A good way to think about this is that it's for a given depth of precipitation, this is the number of millimeters of that precipitation that's converted to runoff. For example, given 400 millimeters of winter precipitation in a ponderosa pine forest, you'll get approximately 100 millimeters of that converted to runoff, or about 25%. This shows how, for a given precipitation level, less runoff is produced in the lower elevation vegetation types. Additionally, a small increase in runoff is expected following restoration treatments. We developed regression equations for the increase above baseline level in runoff expected following restoration, using data from thinning experiments that were performed at the paired watershed study sites. We developed unique equations for ponderosa pine and mixed conifer and applied these to cells that had recently been restored in the model simulations. Wildfires would also likely result in an increase in runoff due to the reduction in evapotranspiration and change in cover type. However, due to the reductions in water quality that are also associated with wildfire, it's unlikely that the increases from wildfire would be useful to people or to habitat. So we did not account for increases in runoff due to high-severity wildfire. I'll discuss high-severity wildfire more in the sediment yield vulnerability assessment. This shows how the equation represents the change in runoff in ponderosa pine following restoration. The increase in runoff due to restoration is positively related to winter precipitation in the years following the restoration treatments and the thinning intensity in terms of basal area reduction. It decreases during the time since thinning for ponderosa pine. The mixed conifer equation is very similar in terms of climate and thinning intensity. However, there was not a significant decrease following in the time since thinning. The outputs of the hydrologic model for each model cell are an undisturbed forest water yield and a change in water yield due to restoration if the model cell was recently restored. We add those together to get a total runoff for each cell in the model. That can then be added up and averaged to give the runoff for the entire plateau or for specific areas of the plateau that we're interested in. Before I get into the methods for the sediment yield vulnerability assessment, I'm going to go over some of the results of the hydrologic modeling in terms of water yield amounts, and we'll discuss water quality later in the talk. This shows the total runoff, and again, working in terms of depth for the Kaibab Plateau for a median precipitation year. So you can think of this as the average precipitation conditions. In terms of cases without restoration, and this is shown by the black circles, lines here, with no climate change, there's about a 2% decrease in total runoff between current conditions and 2100. If we include climate change, that goes up to about a 10% decline between current conditions and 2100. Restoration in terms of low and high is represented by the other two lines. And these were largely effective in mitigating the effects of climate change on total runoff from the Kaibab Plateau under both the no climate change scenario and the RCP 8.5. We also conducted this for the RCP 4.5, and it was roughly in between these two scenarios, so I'm just going to highlight these two in this talk. While both high and low restoration were effective in mitigating the effects of climate change, overall, higher runoff occurred with the high restoration scenario due to those small increases in runoff due to directly to restoration. So looking at the Kaibab Plateau as a whole, this is not that bad. Overall, we only expect about a 10% decrease in runoff under the worst case scenario of high climate change and no restoration being conducted. However, if we look at individual ecoregions, we see more cause for concern. So this is an analysis done of runoff by ecoregion. And here we held the areas for the ecoregions constant. So we might have a point that's currently ponderosa pine that's going to transition to pinyon juniper, but through this whole time series, it's going to be included with the ponderosa pine ecoregion. And again, we're looking at a median runoff year. So this is under average conditions. The bottom line here shows the low elevation ecoregion, which is currently mostly pinyon juniper. This covers the most area on the Kaibab Plateau, but it only contributes about 9% of the total runoff. It generally declines as pinyon juniper is replaced by lower elevation ecosystem types, but that can be reversed somewhat by conducting restoration, as that prevents the spread of high-intensity wildfire on the landscape and slows ecosystem-type transitions. The low mid-elevation, which is mostly currently ponderosa pine, this is shown by the black squares, does show a decline in runoff in the absence of restoration. This is because ponderosa pine is being replaced by pinyon juniper, and that has negative impacts on runoff. That can largely be mitigated by conducting restoration, as that slows the transition of ponderosa to pinyon juniper. The high mid elevation, which is currently mixed conifer, shown by the inverted open triangles, their declines in runoff are less likely because this is where mixed conifer is being replaced by ponderosa pine, which actually has a small positive effect on runoff, so that's less of an area for concern. The largest area for concern is in the high elevation ecosystem types, and this is where we're losing a lot of that spruce fir, and other forest types are slow to move in, so we're getting a lot of non-forest replacement. In the absence of restoration, it's about a 20% reduction in runoff by the end of the century. Restoration, and again, these are the forest types that are not really conducive to restoration. So no restoration is actually being done there, but it does get a benefit from restoration because high severity fire becomes less common on the landscape. So restoration does slow the loss of forest in the high elevation. It improves mid-century outcomes. So around 2050, there's less of a decline with restoration. However, we still get about a 20% decline by the end of the century, even with restoration for the high mid-elevation types. These ecoregions represent the water sources for the Grand Canyon via sinkhole transport of water from surface water into springs. And currently there are tracer studies being done on the Grand Canyon springs to identify where their source areas are. The ones that are of the most concern are those that are being sourced primarily from high elevation forests, as even with restoration, those are likely to be vulnerable. Also of concern are those springs being sourced from the low mid-elevation ponderosa areas, particularly if restoration is not done. So I'm going to talk about the methods for our sediment yield vulnerability analysis. To do this, we took advantage of a data set that was collected before and after the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico. Airborne LiDAR data was collected, which can be used to create a high-resolution elevation map before and after the fire. And using those two elevation maps and taking the difference between the two, it's possible to estimate the post-fire sediment yield from each point on the landscape. Using that data, the authors of the paper developed an equation for sediment yield based on slope and soil burn severity. And the actual numbers for sediment yield are very incident specific, because actual sediment yield depends on the precipitation regime after the fire. But we can use this equation to get an idea of which points in our landscape would be most vulnerable to high sediment yields based on their likelihood of experiencing high severity fire and their physical structure, or their slope. So the way we did our sediment yield vulnerability is we calculated an expected annual sediment yield. And again, this should be taken as a relative measure because it would depend on the individual scenario. But the way we calculated this was to take the entire set of LANDIS simulations that we had, and for each model cell, look at how many fires of different severities happened during that time, and figure out the probability that any of these fire severity classes would occur in a given year. And then based on both the slope, based on the slope of the cell calculated from a USGS digital elevation model, calculated the expected sediment yield that would occur using the equations from the Las Conchas fire. That gives us a relative measure of sediment yield vulnerability for each model cell based on both the physical structure of the cell and its likelihood of experiencing fires of different severities. These maps show the calculated sediment yield vulnerability for each point on the Kaibab Plateau. And again, we want to look at this in terms of relative numbers. So the yellow areas are the areas of high concern for sediment yield. So the areas that we see in the absence of restoration are the high slope areas along the canyon rim. Additionally, there's high concern for sediment yield in a lot of these areas that are covered by the mid-elevation forest, the mixed conifer and ponderosa, because that's where high severity fires are most likely. With restoration, we get a large improvement in the sediment yield vulnerability of those mid-elevation forests by preventing high severity wildfires in those areas. But it's also effective in reducing the sediment yield vulnerability of the high elevation and the low elevation forests, again by reducing the occurrence and spread of high severity fire on the landscape. So the conclusions for this part is that high elevation forests are most vulnerable to reductions in water yield due to climate change, and that vulnerability, there's really not a lot that restoration can do for that. A high restoration rate is effective in mitigating the effects of climate change in mid-elevation forests, and restoration is also effective in reducing the vulnerability of these areas to post-fire sediment yield, particularly in the mid-elevation forests, but also in the high and low elevation forests by reducing the occurrence of high severity fire on the landscape. Okay, with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I want to acknowledge our funding sources again, and additionally, here is our contact information if you have any additional questions about the research for us.
Thank you, Francis. Just a reminder to you folks in the audience, if you'd like to ask Francis or even Will some questions or have some big, broad questions, feel free to either type them in and send them to me, the host, and I'll read them to Francis and Will, or you can unmute yourselves by pressing *6 and ask that question by phone. So we'll take a few minutes here and wait for questions. If anybody has a phone question, feel free to unmute yourself by pressing *6 and ask the question. And just a reminder to everybody, this webinar is being recorded, and I'll be sending a link to the recording as well as PDFs of their slides next week sometime, and also have their contact information. Well, I haven't gotten anything sent to me, Francis or Will. Just one more call out there for, again, a question by phone. You can press *6 to unmute yourself. But in the meantime, I will read this question from Rob. What are the uncertainties regarding the Los Conchos sediment curves as applied to the Kaibab?
Yeah, so there's obviously a number of uncertainties. The biggest one is that it does depend on what precipitation you get following the fire. So fires that occur at different times of year, you know, pre-monsoon versus post-monsoon could have some big differences there. But I think in terms of the relative amount of sediment, the areas that are going to produce high sediment yields are going to be the same under both cases. You know, there were also some issues with that analysis in terms of looking at scale and how you average your cells to create points for the model. And I was using sort of their intermediate range estimate, but again, it's possible that wouldn't capture, you know, possibly if you had some very small, high slope, high severity area within a larger grid cell, there could be some issues there.
Thanks, Francis. We got a comment saying thanks to both presenters for very clear and informative presentations. Next, we have a question from Suzanne. She's asking, is there a difference in soils that might preclude some species from moving into areas where they were not already present?
I'm going to let Will take that.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know details about that. I would suspect that, I mean, there may be some delay related to that, but not in terms of, like, I just think of like a landscape like the San Francisco peaks. And as you go up there, as you get beyond the spruce fir into the upper elevation pines up there, that like it's really kind of rocky, and there's very little soil in the very upper elevations, and that's not the case on the Kaibab Plateau, where you have, you know, fairly well or developed soils across much of the plateau within that region. So I don't see that as being a huge issue. Drainage could have some effect, and there are some meadows on the plateau that don't, you know, that are potentially created due to a lack of drainage. And so that, you know, that could possibly have some effect in terms of, let's say, ponderosa pine invading those kind of high elevation meadows up on the plateau.
Thanks, Will. I have no more questions coming in. Let's see, we can call out one more time for folks in the audience if they want to ask a question by phone. We'd be happy to take your question. All right. Well, it doesn't appear to be anybody's in the process of asking a question. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Got another thank you for answering that last question. First of all, Will and Francis, is there anything that you like to wrap up with? anything maybe you thought about or any of the questions prompted that you'd like to expand on?
I guess, well, so I would say one thing, it's sort of one of my conclusions is the decline of the mesic conifers, so mixed conifer, spruce fir, and aspen on the plateau. And so, that seems pretty dire for those of us that know that landscape. And so I would say that, one caveat or uncertainty about this modeling approach, and John Rice's question got about this a little bit, but in terms of the scale that we're looking at, it's, species viability is projected across that, is consistent across that whole high elevation zone. And so we're not looking at fine scale topographic changes. And so, it is possible that there are areas of drainages or slightly cooler or moister topographic positions or aspects will enable those high elevation species to persist for longer and potentially regenerate and persist there in kind of small refugia. And so, that our fairly coarse scale is not necessarily going to capture that. So that is, one possibility that there may not be a complete decline of those high elevation species over the next century. So I'll just end with that perhaps optimistic note.
Thanks, Will. Francis, anything or?
Yeah, and I guess one thing to add is, when we sort of filter all this down to the water side of it is, you have to think about all the different priorities here. So, we say that, okay, this one ecoregion is not that vulnerable to runoff loss. That's not because bad changes aren't happening there. Mixed conifer is being lost. It's just if it transitions to ponderosa, it doesn't have a largely negative effect on runoff. But there are still a lot of other issues associated with that vegetation transition.
Thank you. Great. Well, on that note, we're ready to close down the webinar. First of all, though, last of all, I'd like to thank the audience for attending today, of course, and to you, Will and Francis, for taking the time to present. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for attending.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So farewell to everybody. Enjoy your day, and we'll see you hopefully in the next couple months on another webinar. Take care.